Dr. Michael Keas, wonderful to have you here. Today we will look at Unbelievable, the 7 myths about the history and future of science and religion. That is your book that was released earlier this year in January.
That's right. I enjoyed writing it, and I'm glad it's seen the light of day.
That's wonderful. You start off in the book and you explain that there are predominantly 7 myths that are prevalent all around society, and especially from the new atheist camp. Mm-hmm. And you start immediately with the first one, and you mentioned that there's sort of a mention that the Dark Ages never happened. What is that about, and how will you speak to somebody about that? Because the predominant view is that there was a Dark Ages.
Yes, so from the time of the fall of the Roman Empire until around the time of Columbus, 1492, his famous trip, those are labeled the Middle Ages, but some continue to call them the Dark Ages, and erroneously so, because there were some significant developments that occurred in culture in general, technology, and in science that would caused me to relabel them more an age of illumination. Just think of those beautiful stained glass windows in the cathedrals that were massive feats of technological prowess to be able to build such buildings. And then the foundations of modern science were also laid in this period that was so highly influenced by the Christian church. And that's why it's an anti-Christian myth to label them the Dark Ages, as if the church held back the growth of science.
That is excellent. I want to read you a quote from your own book on page 39. You basically said the following: although the Dark Ages myth began as an expression of chronologically styled snobbery by literary personalities who typically cared a little about science, it soon morphed into an anti-Catholic discourse amongst the Protestant educators, including scientists, and it finally became a generic assault on the intellectual respectability of Christians as a whole. Right. We see this progressive understanding that ultimately everybody is anathematized because science is king, and ultimately what's wrong with that?
Right, and perhaps a good case history of how Christians of different denominations should think twice before bending over backwards to be overly critical. I mean, sure, we have our distinctives, and that's fine, but to do bad history in order to make the other denomination look bad is not good policy. It's not good history, and it turned out to backfire on Christianity in general, because then, as in the Enlightenment, 18th century and since, a lot of these stories have been used against all Christians, not just against Catholic Christians.
Yeah, that is incredible. I think we see even today, and one of the things that you mentioned, and something that is really coming back into our culture, is the idea that the earth is flat, and especially that the church believed that the earth was flat. And I want to read you something again from page 42 of your book. You read a tweet from Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he says the following, taking it obviously from Carl Sagan: the Christians in charge of these horrible ages are alleged to have enslaved humanity, and he says in a paraphrase, I mean mentally, with flat earth nonsense.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the most persistent of these 7 myths that I debunk in my book, Unbelievable. And I called my book Unbelievable because once you get the facts straight from history, the stories that these atheists are telling nowadays themselves are unbelievable. Yeah. So, for example, as you mentioned, Neil deGrasse Tyson, a leading communicator of science, not a leading scientist, but a leading communicator of scientific ideas, as well as materialism as a way of trying to show that science has larger worldview implications to attack the idea of God. And part of the way he does this attack on God is through history of science, or through misconceptions about the history of science in this case. So Tyson, he says, well, during the Middle Ages, people thought the earth was flat. Yeah, in antiquity, before the Middle Ages, the ancient pagan Greeks knew it was round and had good reasons for it, but this knowledge was lost during the Middle Ages. Well, look, as a professional historian of science, I can tell you that my colleagues, regardless of their religious orientation, know that people in the Middle Ages, during the time of great influence of the Christian church, knew the earth was round. And after having taught astronomy to college students for a quarter century, I can tell you that most college students today, and these students all happen to be in the U.S., but it would apply to any country really, most college students today have fewer reasons to give for a round Earth than most medieval students did. Now, of course, students today know a lot of other subjects, of course, but on this particular topic, because I've tested this by having students kind of debate these ideas, most students can't give you reasons. Like, for example, here's one reason that was known in antiquity and through the Middle Ages, that during a lunar eclipse, that's when the shadow of the Earth is cast on the moon, and as it goes across the moon, you can see the edge of that shadow is curved, indicating that the thing casting the shadow, Earth, is also curved, and it happens time and time and again, regardless of the orientation. So it looks like we've got a round Earth here, a spherical Earth. And that plus another half dozen or more arguments, medieval students knew quite well. And typically college students today can only come up with maybe one or two of these and not give some of them none of these arguments, you know. So
yeah, I think the dominant idea that is given is that the church predominantly suppressed all these scientists and basically all these astronomers, and even Kepler himself, you mentioned, was a very devout Christian, and even somebody like Newton, or well, you can look at a lot more scientists, basically held that their belief in God was never in conflict with science. So would you agree with the statement that says that the church is ultimately, even today, anti-scientific?
No, because the historical track record is quite otherwise. Look, who invented the university? Christians did. Yeah, there were other educational institutions in other cultures in earlier times, but in terms of what we take to be university, a self-governing educational system that particularly has proliferated all over the world and has been a tremendous home for science and other important disciplines. That whole idea came from late medieval Europe, and so that if the church was trying to be anti-science, they were doing a really bad job at it, because about a third of the curriculum in these medieval universities was math and science.
Yeah.
And they also the church also supported astronomy both within and outside the university, was the major funder of astronomy as a discipline for even into the early modern period of Kepler and Galileo and those folks. So yeah, the church has a great track record of being pro-science, not anti-science.
Well, a good question then is, what did everyone get wrong about Galileo and his clash with the church?
Yes.
And why does it matter today?
Yeah, the Galileo story is usually trotted out as, Exhibit A, that the church is anti-science. On the surface, it kind of looks that way. But when you dig down deeper, you find it otherwise. For example, there were theologians that were on Galileo's side saying, the Bible doesn't really teach one way or another whether Earth moves or the sun moves. It's neutral on that topic. And Galileo understood that as well. And then Galileo, of course, was arguing from science that the Earth moves around the sun rather than the sun moving around the Earth. So, but in Galileo's day, he couldn't actually prove that. He had arguments for it, but there were other arguments for other positions. Besides the ancient view, the traditional view that Earth is at rest and all the other objects go around the Earth, there was also a hybrid view between these two, which I won't go into the details, but that hybrid view actually had the best scientific support during Galileo's time. It was the Tychonic system. Just brushing the details aside, took a little bit of both of these theories and blended them together, because there was no good scientific evidence Earth actually moved. And even today, you don't feel it, you don't sense it, but there are, of course, good arguments for it that came to the surface about a generation after Galileo.
Oh, wow.
So the church was right. In this case, Galileo's church was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was right in pointing out to Galileo that he had not proved his point, and he had overstated his case for a moving Earth. But of course, it was during the Counter-Reformation, so the Catholic Church was a little hypersensitive to anyone who challenged church authority or perceived church authority, because again, there were theologians both pro and anti-Galileo, as well as scientists or natural philosophers or astronomers, as they were called at the time. There were some that were with Galileo, although that was a very small minority of scientists, and the majority of scientists were against Galileo because the scientific evidence hadn't clearly shown yet what we now know to be beyond reasonable doubt, that Earth moves around the sun.
That's excellent.
Yeah. So it really wasn't science versus religion. It was two different factions of scientists and two different factions of theologians. And he never was tortured or put in prison for any length of time. And so these are all parts of the myth that make it look like it's Galileo and science versus church and religion. Not so.
Yeah, and I think it was Richard Dawkins recently in an interview on a British TV network stated that anybody that goes and studies the scientific method and applies it to the Bible will, in actual fact, not be Christian. What is your sentiment surrounding that?
Well, I also wear another hat as philosopher of science,
Yes.
besides historian of science, and I've published an essay on this that's you can find by just Googling my last name, Keas, or it looks like Chaos, actually, K-E-A-S. So Virtues Chaos, if you Google that, you'll find this essay where I talk about the different traits of good theories, particularly in the natural sciences, but many of them apply to human history. And of course, many prominent scientists have been Christians, and for that matter, about half of U.S. scientists today believe in God. Maybe not the Christian God, but believe that atheism is not the answer. So, but these traits of theories that indicate likely truth apply to historical questions like what happened after Jesus' death. And there's good evidence that he rose from the dead. And you run through these same traits, you know, the evidential accuracy, and was there an adequate cause or motive for the disciples to die martyrs' deaths? And the whole origin of the church itself is difficult to explain without the resurrection. So using the same methods of reasoning of how you reconstruct past events that you can't go back to in a time machine, that applies to human history. It also applies to natural history. What happened in the history of the earth to bring us to this point? So scientists and historians of human history are using a lot of the same methods here, and it's a rational enterprise to conclude that Christianity is very, very likely true just given the evidence. But of course, once you've experienced God, then that opens up a whole new dimension where it can become beyond any reasonable doubt that you have a relationship with God, which is the case in my experience.
No, excellent. You basically give this quote from humanist George Abel, who had this anti-theistic view on page 11 of your book.
Yeah.
And he says the following, and I want to quote this to you because it just hinges onto what we're saying. He says, I think most people want very much to have something concrete to hang their hats on and believe in, which is why people are religious. Where did the universe come from? Well, it's much easier to say God made it than to say I don't know. Again, what we find is the general sentiment that ultimately if you do not believe in science, you cannot be a Christian. And ultimately, the idea is given that if you're a good Christian, that ultimately you should be anti-science.
Right.
And so we are generally left once more with people that say the scientific method is the only way to know truth. Yet I would just ask you, does the scientific method explain everything?
No, but it does explain, well, natural phenomena. I mean, science is the attempt to explain natural phenomena. And if you're really an open-minded scientist, then that means any kind of cause, not just unguided material causes. Now, when it comes to the way nature operates, typically, I mean, we explain it in terms of other material causes. But when it comes to the origin of life and the origin of consciousness in humanity, the natural laws and events are not adequate to explain the origin of these things in the first place. We're well equipped within the natural sciences, appealing to natural causes to explain the continuation of these processes, but how they originated in the first place is not well explained that way, but is better explained by an intelligent cause. And you can go to discovery.org. I'm a fellow of Discovery Institute. We have lots of resources by contemporary scientists who show that. But my expertise is to show that the long track record of Christianity and science is they play well together. They actually mutually reinforce each other. And so I can show that as a historian and a philosopher of science, that that's the case. So,
I saw with a new atheist like Sam Harris, there's almost a global spirituality without it being rooted and grounded in God. And in your book, you mentioned that there's quite a few new myths that are basically emerging as a result of this understanding that we can explain things supernaturally, but we should not give them a supernatural price tag, if it will. What are some of those myths, and what would you say is growing in the global zeitgeist or consciousness of man?
Yeah, so Rudolph, in my book, after debunking 6 historic myths, I move on to this futuristic myth that I call the extraterrestrial enlightenment myth. And the reason I do it in my book is because if you believe the first 6 myths that make Christianity look anti-science, when it's really not, then it leaves a significance void. A lot of people are searching for, well, if God doesn't exist, if if to be modern and scientific and rational you have to give up on God, then what's the purpose of human life? And do we have anything to look forward to? Anything that would help save us from nuclear holocaust, which is, obviously a big fear that many people have.
Yes.
And a number of philosophers and scientists are turning to the hope that if aliens were to arrive on the planet, because of the vast distances of space to even possibly habitable planets, that their technology would have to be so vast that it would appear magical, kind of like the world of Harry Potter had just broken out. And that they also, some of them, go on to say that these creatures would be morally and spiritually superior to us because they would have had many millions or billions of years of cultural and technological evolution to go beyond us. This is all just pretty much taken out of thin air because to believe that, if a creature arrives on the planet that's doing what looks like miracles and just to say, well, of course they're aliens, is a very strong bias against the possibility that there could be supernatural beings that could take material form that might want to sidetrack people from the truth. This is a possibility that anyone could imagine. So how would the new atheists be able to help other people distinguish between the alien, naturalistic interpretation of this creature or creatures and the supernatural interpretation, that these are beings that have actually supernatural powers? Well, they wouldn't have the resources because they have already imaginatively extrapolated into, given enough time, technology could do anything. But, look, there's one thing technology can't do. It can never overcome the laws of nature. That's just, it can't do that. So this imaginative extrapolation almost kind of loosens up that fundamental truth to the point where people would be gullible to believe that anything that appears, no matter how supernatural, would be, just aliens. And that might be, and that might trigger global deception. I mean, there's reason, and I came to this myth not by reading the book of Revelation, but by just reading atheists and agnostics, what they're saying about aliens. And I thought, this sounds vaguely familiar to some possible ways in which this could be, a massive deception could be pulled off. And that's why I included it in my book.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the other thing is that I found fascinating is that a lot of people think that reality cannot be adequately explained. And with the release of the movies of the Wachowski brothers, a very good scientific question would be, are we in a matrix? How can we determine that we are in a solid reality?
Right. Well, Rudolph, the way that we know that we're not in a massive computer simulation is that there's no computer glitches, right? Well, that's a standard joke I tell, because look, doubts come cheap. You can always doubt anything, and you can't disprove skeptics, but it's just not a very livable philosophy because, sure, you can believe that we're in a computer simulation that's been created by aliens or whatever, but it's just most people realize they have this deep down lived out intuition that's these are myths made up by people who have a little too much time on their hands, right? Yes. To create sources of skepticism. So, but it's, look, most of us realize that, there is an actual world out here. We experienced, physical objects, and even though we may not have a full account of how all this happens, we know that there's more intelligent, that I'm an intelligence talking to another embodied intelligence, and we're having a conversation now. And so doubts come cheap, but there is good, and again, looking at the historical evidence of, Christianity is the only religion that is testable to a high degree, because it hinges on the event of the resurrection. And that makes it a legitimate thing to believe once you see the evidence. And so no amount of belief in aliens is going to override that, whether you see them as appearing privately to you. There's thousands of reports of people claiming to have had contact with aliens, but they're all private experiences. A lot of them, frankly, sound demonic.
Yeah, for sure.
When you look at some of the details of them. So, I think you should be open-minded to interpreting each event, whether it's natural in origin or supernatural, and take it on a case-by-case basis and solve them one by one. Because you'd have to just look at the evidence. What is the evidence of that event, and then look at it rationally.
the interesting thing is you wrote about Copernicus in your book, and you mentioned that ultimately, when we look at his ideas, ultimately science came to an understanding that humanity as a whole is sort of demoted as the center of the universe. Would you agree with that, and would you say that there is rather today a deep-seated spirituality, but rather a very much a consciousness that is focused rather on the self than anything outside of itself? And how do we as Christians, and how do we come as theologians, and how do we speak to a culture in a world like that?
Yeah, when we speak of someone being self-centered or self-absorbed, that carries the modern idea of center being the place of importance. And of course, often we need to help children, typically part of education and parenting is help children and young adults become less self-centered and to realize, to take into account other people and so on, and to develop in their character. But the very idea of center being the place of importance is a modern way of looking at that, because in the pre-modern world, before Copernicus, the center of the universe was considered the bottom of the universe, the place of dishonor, not the place of honor. So, because that goes back to Aristotle's ideas that the earth element naturally falls toward the center of the universe, and it naturally makes a spherical object, and that's why they believe in the spherical universe. And part of that sounds very much like gravity, but they thought that there was only one, Aristotle did, that there's only one unique center to the universe, and that was the bottom of the universe, the place of corruption, where things fall apart. Well, yeah, things generate, but things also fall apart, where the heavens were considered incorruptible. And it was actually Christians who began to critique this dichotomy between the part of the universe below the moon, including the earth and the atmosphere, and the part of the universe up from the moon on up, saying, no, wait, it would be more likely that God would have made one unified universe. That's the very idea of a universe, right? With one set of laws, and they critiqued this dichotomy in part from Scripture, where it says that the heavens will grow old like a garment, which people under the age of 25 may not realize, but clothing actually does wear out eventually.
Yeah, for sure.
And the universe also wears out. Suns have life cycles, and by the time of Kepler, so after the Middle Ages, into the early modern period, Kepler actually cited that verse in the Psalms that talks about the heavens growing old like a garment, and said, yeah, and now we see what they called nova, or new stars, which we now know are supernova, or stars exploding where that pulse of light reaches the planet. Those are changes in the heavens, and then those stars would grow weaker and then would disappear from view, at least given the instruments they had at the time. So clearly there are changes in the heavens, and the Bible had taught that all along because it was illustrating how God doesn't change in his essential nature, but the natural world does. And so it's a creature. It's not, whereas the ancient pagans thought of the universe as divine, like the body of God that would never change, at least from the moon on up. And so Christians critique this in part because of their Christian theology, and this proved to be very fruitful for science. So those who claim that, well, we were removed from the privileged center, they get it wrong because the center was the place of dishonor. And in many ways, the early Copernicans framed this as a promotion for Earth. We're not in the bottom of the universe. We're up joining the dance of the stars, as Galileo put it.
Yeah, that is incredible. Dr. Keas, it was wonderful to have you here, and it was wonderful to have a discussion with you. And could I invite you back?
Sure.
And again, if you come to South Africa, you have to make a turn here, and we can discuss some other things that you've also written. But thank you so much.
Sure. Cheers.
Thank you.